Margaret Thompson clutched her threadbare coat tighter as the bitter December wind whipped through the abandoned parking lot behind the closed grocery store. Her 3 children huddled close to her, their small faces red from the cold, their thin jackets inadequate against the harsh Montana winter. 8-year-old Emma, 6-year-old Lucas, and 4-year-old Lily had been living in their broken-down sedan for 3 weeks now, ever since their landlord had changed the locks without warning. The eviction notice had been a cruel joke. They'd been paying rent faithfully until Margaret's husband died in a construction accident 6 months ago. The insurance company had delayed the payout, citing an investigation into the incident. Meanwhile, bills piled up, and Margaret's part-time job at the local diner barely covered food, let alone rent. When she'd approached her landlord, Dennis Morrison, explaining her situation and showing him the pending insurance paperwork, he'd laughed in her face. "Not my problem, lady," he'd sneered, his gold tooth glinting. "Money talks, sob stories walk. You've got 48 hours to catch up on 3 months' rent or you're out." Margaret had begged for more time, explained that the insurance settlement would cover everything plus late fees. Morrison had simply shrugged and walked away, muttering something about bleeding heart nonsense. 2 days later, she'd returned from work to find their belongings scattered on the sidewalk and new locks on the door. Now, as snow began to fall heavily, Margaret watched her children's lips turn blue. The car's heater had died last week, and they'd been taking turns sleeping in the front seat to stay somewhat warm. Emma, always the little mother, had been melting snow in an old coffee can over a small camping stove Margaret had bought from a pawn shop with her last $20. "Mommy, I'm hungry," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. Margaret's heart shattered. She'd spent her final few dollars on a loaf of bread and peanut butter yesterday, but that was gone now. She looked at the fresh snow accumulating on the ground and felt desperation wash over her. She'd heard somewhere that snow was just frozen water, that it could help with thirst if nothing else was available. "Come here, sweethearts," she said softly, kneeling down and scooping up some of the cleaner snow from the car's hood. "This will help with the thirst for now." The children obediently opened their mouths, and Margaret felt tears freeze on her cheeks as she fed them snow. This wasn't how she'd imagined raising her children. Before the accident, they'd had a small but comfortable home, regular meals, and dreams of Luca's starting Little League in the spring. As she fed her children snow, Margaret noticed a large pickup truck pulling into the parking lot. The vehicle's headlights cut through the falling snow, and she instinctively pulled her children closer, fear rising in her chest. Late-night encounters with strangers rarely ended well for a woman alone with 3 small children. The truck came to a stop about 20 feet away, and Margaret could see the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat. He sat there for a long moment, engine running, windshield wipers rhythmically clearing the accumulating snow. Margaret's maternal instincts kicked into high gear, and she quickly ushered her children toward their car, fumbling with the keys with numb fingers. "Get in the car quickly," she whispered urgently to Emma, who immediately understood the gravity of the situation and helped her younger siblings into the backseat. Margaret's hands shook as she tried to start the engine, but the old sedan wheezed and refused to turn over. The battery was dying, just like everything else in their lives. Through the rear window, she watched as the pickup truck's door opened and a tall figure stepped out into the snow. Daniel Rodriguez had been driving home from another failed doctor's appointment when he'd spotted the family in the parking lot. He and his wife Maria had been trying to have children for 8 years, enduring countless fertility treatments, procedures, and heartbreaking disappointments. Tonight's appointment had been the final consultation before they'd officially give up on their dream of biological children. As he'd driven past the grocery store, something had caught his eye in his peripheral vision. A woman kneeling in the snow, surrounded by 3 small children. At first, he'd thought they might be building a snowman or having some kind of winter adventure. But as he'd slowed down and looked more carefully, he'd realized something was terribly wrong. The woman was feeding snow to the children. Daniel had pulled his truck around and parked, his rancher's instincts telling him these people were in serious trouble. He'd grown up poor himself, the son of migrant workers who'd struggled to put food on the table. He recognized desperation when he saw it, and this family was in crisis. Now, as he approached their car, he could see the woman's terrified face through the window. She was probably in her early 30s, with dark hair and hollow cheeks that spoke of too many missed meals. The children were pressed against her, their eyes wide with fear and hunger. Daniel raised his hands peacefully and stopped several feet from the car. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice gentle but carrying over the wind. "I'm not here to hurt you. I saw you and your children, and I'm wondering if you need help." Margaret's finger hovered over the car's lock button, though she wasn't sure it would matter if this man meant them harm. She studied his face in the dim light from the parking lot's single working street lamp. He was probably in his 40s, with weathered features and kind eyes. His clothes were clean but practical, the kind worn by someone who worked with their hands. "We're fine," she called back, though her voice cracked on the words. "Just taking a break." Daniel nodded, understanding her caution. "I run a ranch about 10 miles outside town. Big place, mostly empty except for me and my wife. We've got hot food, warm beds, and we're not looking for anything in return." He paused, letting that sink in. "Ma'am, I watched you feeding snow to your children. That's not something anyone does unless they're out of options." Margaret felt her defenses crumbling. This stranger had seen her at her absolute lowest point, and instead of judgment, he was offering help. Still, she'd learned to be wary of offers that seemed too good to be true. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you help strangers?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, snow collecting on his jacket's shoulders. "Because someone helped me once when I was about your boy's age. My family was living out of our car, following harvest work. A rancher gave us a place to stay, and it changed everything." He gestured toward his truck. "I've got a thermos of hot coffee in there, and my wife's got a pot of stew on the stove at home. No strings attached." Margaret looked at her children, who were watching the conversation with wide eyes. Emma was trying to be brave, but Margaret could see her daughter's exhaustion. Lucas was shivering despite being wrapped in their one decent blanket, and Lily had fallen asleep against her brother's shoulder. "What's your name?" Margaret asked, still cautious but feeling something shift inside her chest. "Daniel Rodriguez. I own the Double R Ranch. Been there 15 years now. He pulled out his wallet and carefully extracted a business card, holding it where she could see it. You can call the sheriff's office if you want to check on me. Ask for Deputy Chen. He's bought cattle from me for years. Margaret's mind raced. She'd heard of the Double R Ranch. It was one of the larger spreads in the area, known for raising quality beef cattle. If this man was really the owner, he wasn't some drifter or opportunist. Still, the offer seemed impossible. I don't understand, she said, rolling down the window just a crack. You don't even know us. Daniel smiled sadly. My wife and we've been trying to have children for a long time, seeing kids hungry and cold. He trailed off, then cleared his throat. Look, I'm not asking you to trust me completely, but your children need food and warmth tonight. Come to the ranch, eat something hot, get a good night's sleep. In the morning, if you want to leave, I'll drive you wherever you need to go. Margaret felt tears starting again. We don't have any money to pay you. I'm not asking for money. Daniel stepped back slightly, giving her space to think. I'm asking you to let me help. Sometimes that's all there is to it. The car fell silent except for the sound of wind and the occasional creak of metal contracting in the cold. Margaret looked at her children again, these precious souls who deserved so much better than this nightmare their lives had become. Emma was watching her with an expression far too mature for an 8-year-old, and Margaret realized her daughter was trying to help her make this impossible decision. Mommy, Emma whispered, I think we should go with him. Margaret's heart clenched. Her eldest daughter had been forced to grow up too fast, had seen too much hardship already. The trust in Emma's voice was both heartbreaking and decisive. Okay, Margaret said, her voice stronger now. We'll come with you. Daniel nodded, relief evident on his face. I'll help you get your things. As they transferred their meager belongings from the car to Daniel's truck, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that this was either the best decision she'd ever made, or the worst. But as she buckled Lily into the truck's back seat and felt the warmth from the heater wash over her daughter's small body, she chose to believe in this stranger's kindness. The ranch house appeared in the truck's headlights after a 20-minute drive through winding country roads. It was a large, 2-story building with warm light glowing from several windows. Smoke curled from the chimney, and Margaret could see a wraparound porch with rocking chairs that spoke of peaceful evenings and family gatherings. As they pulled into the circular driveway, the front door opened, and a petite woman with graying hair appeared. She wore a thick sweater and jeans, and her face was etched with concern as she hurried toward the truck. This is my wife, Maria, Daniel said as he helped the children out of the truck. Maria, this is Margaret and her children. Maria's eyes immediately went to the children, and Margaret saw her expression soften with unmistakable maternal instinct. Oh, you poor dears, she murmured, kneeling to Emma's level. You must be so cold and hungry. Come inside right now. The warmth hit them like a physical wall as they entered the house. Margaret hadn't realized how numb she'd become until feeling returned to her fingers and toes in painful tingles. The interior was comfortable but not ostentatious, worn leather furniture, family photos on the walls, and the lingering scent of something delicious cooking. I've got stew ready, Maria said, bustling toward what Margaret assumed was the kitchen. And fresh bread. Daniel, can you get some blankets for the children? Within minutes, Margaret and her children were seated at a large wooden dining table, bowls of steaming beef stew placed before them. The children dug in with an enthusiasm that made Margaret's heart ache, while she ate more slowly, still processing the surreal turn their evening had taken. So, Maria said gently, settling into the chair across from Margaret with her own bowl, Daniel mentioned you've been having some difficulties. Margaret found herself telling their story, the accident, the insurance delays, the eviction. Maria listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions or making sympathetic sounds. When Margaret finished, Maria reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're safe now," she said simply, "for as long as you need." That night, Margaret tucked her children into real beds for the first time in weeks. The guest room had twin beds with thick comforters, and Lily had fallen asleep almost immediately after her bath. Emma and Lucas shared whispered conversations about the day's events, their voices filled with cautious hope. As Margaret stood in the doorway watching them sleep, Maria appeared beside her. "They're beautiful children," Maria said softly. "They're everything to me," Margaret replied. "I've been so scared I was failing them." "You're not failing them. You're surviving and you're keeping them together. That's what matters." Margaret turned to face her hostess. "Why are you doing this, really?" Maria was quiet for a long moment. "We've been trying to have children for years," she said finally. "Fertility treatments, specialists, prayers. Nothing worked. I was beginning to think God didn't want us to be parents." She paused. "Maybe this is His way of showing us we were wrong." The next morning brought fresh snowfall and the aroma of pancakes and bacon. Margaret woke to find clean clothes laid out on the dresser, simple but well-made garments that looked like they'd fit her perfectly. When she made her way to the kitchen, she found her children already dressed and helping Maria set the table. "Good morning," Daniel said, looking up from his newspaper. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in months," Margaret admitted. "But I should probably start looking for work today. I can't impose on your hospitality indefinitely." Daniel and Maria exchanged a look that Margaret couldn't quite interpret. "Actually," Maria said, "we were hopping to discuss something with you. Daniel needs help with the ranch books, and I could use assistance with the house and garden. If you're interested, the job comes with housing and a good salary." Margaret stared at them. "You're offering me a job." "We're offering you a life," Daniel said simply, "if you want it." Margaret felt tears threatening again. "I don't understand why you're being so kind to us." "Because kindness is what makes us human," Maria replied. "And because sometimes, when you think your dreams are impossible, the universe sends you exactly what you need in a completely unexpected way." Margaret looked at her children, who were watching the adult conversation with interest. Emma caught her eye and nodded slightly, and Margaret realized her daughter was giving her permission to accept this incredible offer. "Yes," Margaret said, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Yes, we'd like that very much." As the weeks passed, Margaret settled into a routine that felt almost too good to be true. She worked mornings in Daniel's office, organizing receipts and managing accounts, while the children attended the local school. Afternoons were spent helping Maria with household tasks and tending to the large vegetable garden that would come alive again in spring. The children thrived in their new environment. Lucas discovered a love for the horses, and Daniel began teaching him basic writing skills. Emma excelled in her new school and made friends quickly. Lily, the youngest, attached herself to Maria with the natural affection of a child who'd found a grandmother figure. Margaret found herself relaxing for the first time since her husband's death. The constant stress of survival had lifted, replaced by the simple pleasure of meaningful work and secure housing. She and Maria developed a close friendship, sharing cooking duties and evening conversations on the porch. But Margaret's past wasn't ready to let her go. One afternoon in late January, she was working in Daniel's office when she heard a familiar voice in the front yard. Through the window, she saw Dennis Morrison, her former landlord, climbing out of his expensive sedan and straightening his tie. Margaret's blood ran cold. Morrison had somehow found her, and his presence here could only mean trouble. Daniel met Morrison at the front door, and Margaret could hear raised voices even through the thick walls of the house. She crept closer to the window, straining to hear the conversation. "I'm telling you she owes me money," Morrison was saying, his voice carrying that same arrogant tone Margaret remembered. 3 months' rent plus damages. I've got a legal right to collect. "And I'm telling you to get off my property," Daniel replied, his voice calm but steely. "Margaret and her children are under my protection now." Morrison laughed nastily. "Protection? What are you, some kind of vigilante? I've got court papers right here. She owes me $4,000 and I'm not leaving without it." Margaret's heart sank. $4,000 might as well have been $4 million. Even with her new job, she couldn't hope to save that much anytime soon. The insurance settlement was still tied up in legal proceedings, and Morrison knew it. "Let me see those papers," Daniel said. Margaret watched as Morrison handed over a folder, smugness radiating from his posture. Daniel studied the documents carefully, his expression unreadable. "These papers are for collection of unpaid rent," Daniel said finally. "But according to Montana law, you can't collect rent from a tenant you illegally evicted." "Illegally evicted," Morrison scoffed. "I gave her notice." 48 hours notice for a 3-month arrearage. That's not legal notice, and you know it. You also changed the locks without a court order and disposed of personal property without following proper procedures. Margaret saw Morrison's confidence waver slightly. "Look, I just want what's owed to me." "What's owed?" Daniel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet, "is an apology to a widow and her children for your cruelty. But since I doubt you're capable of that, I suggest you leave before I call the sheriff." "You can't intimidate me," Morrison blustered. "I'll take this to court." "You do that," Daniel replied. "And when you do, make sure you mention how you threw a grieving widow and 3 children onto the street in December. I'm sure the judge will find that very interesting." Morrison's face reddened with anger and embarrassment. "This isn't over," he snarled, snatching the papers back from Daniel. "Yes, it is," Daniel said quietly. "And if you come onto my property again, or if you harass Margaret or her children in any way, you'll discover just how protective I can be." Margaret watched Morrison storm back to his car, tires spinning in the gravel as he drove away. She felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The confrontation was over, but she knew Morrison wasn't the type to give up easily. When Daniel came back inside, he found Margaret sitting at the kitchen table, her hands shaking. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I never meant to bring trouble to your home." Daniel sat down across from her. "You didn't bring trouble, he did. And Margaret, you need to understand something. You and those children are part of this family now. We protect our own. But the money he claims I owe is a fabrication based on an illegal eviction. He might have a civil case for some unpaid rent, but not what he's claiming and not the way he's claiming it. I know some lawyers who specialize in tenant rights. We'll fight this properly." Margaret felt overwhelming gratitude wash over her. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me. You need to trust me. Can you do that?" Margaret nodded, and for the first time since her husband's death, she felt like she wasn't facing her problems alone. Over the following weeks, Daniel made good on his promise. He connected Margaret with a legal aid attorney who specialized in housing law. The lawyer, Patricia Williams, was a sharp woman in her 50s who took one look at Margaret's case and smiled grimly. "This is going to be fun," Patricia said during their first meeting. "I love dealing with slumlords who think they can intimidate people." The legal process moved slowly but surely. Patricia filed a countersuit against Morrison, claiming illegal eviction, improper disposal of personal property, and violations of Montana's landlord-tenant laws. She also contacted the City Housing Authority to report Morrison's other properties for potential violations. Meanwhile, Margaret's life continued to improve. The children were thriving in school, and she'd been promoted to managing Daniel's entire bookkeeping operation. Maria had taught her to can vegetables and preserve meat, skills that made her feel more self-sufficient. One evening in March, as Margaret was helping Maria prepare dinner, she received a phone call that changed everything. "Mrs. Thompson, this is James Mitchell from Northern Plains Insurance. I'm calling about your late husband's policy." Margaret's breath caught. "Yes. I'm pleased to inform you that we've concluded our investigation and approved your claim. The settlement amount is $150,000. We can have a check to you within the week." Margaret sank into a chair, the phone trembling in her hand. $150,000. "Yes, ma'am. Your husband's policy included accidental death benefits, which doubled the base amount. I apologize for the delay in processing your claim." After hanging up, Margaret sat in stunned silence. The money wouldn't bring her husband back, but it would give her and her children security. Real security. When she shared the news with Daniel and Maria, they were genuinely happy for her, without any of the awkwardness she'd feared. They understood that this windfall meant she could leave if she chose to, and their joy for her welfare was completely unselfish. "I want to pay you back," Margaret said immediately, "for everything you've done for us." "You don't owe us anything," Daniel replied. "You've been working hard earning your keep. If anything, we owe you for all the help you've given us. But I want to contribute more. I want to invest in the ranch, become a real partner if you'll have me." Daniel and Maria exchanged one of their meaningful looks. "We'd like that," Maria said softly. "We'd like that very much." The legal battle with Morrison reached its conclusion in April. Patricia Williams had been thorough in her investigation, uncovering a pattern of illegal evictions and housing violations across Morrison's properties. When the case went to court, the judge was not sympathetic to Morrison's claims. "Mr. Morrison," the judge said sternly, "your conduct toward Mrs. Thompson and her minor children was not only legally questionable but morally reprehensible. Not only are you not entitled to the money you're claiming, but you're liable for damages under the state's wrongful eviction statutes." Morrison was ordered to pay Margaret $5,000 in damages and court costs. More importantly, he was placed under investigation by the state attorney general's office for his other properties. "Justice," Patricia said with satisfaction as they left the courthouse, "is a beautiful thing." By summer, Margaret had become a full partner in the Double R Ranch. She'd used part of her insurance settlement to buy into the operation, and her business acumen had helped Daniel expand into new markets. The ranch was more profitable than it had ever been. More importantly, the Rodriguez family had gained 3 children, and Margaret had found a new purpose. She and Maria worked together to transform part of the ranch into a temporary haven for other families in crisis, offering short-term housing and job training for women and children escaping difficult situations. Emma had become the ranch's unofficial horse trainer, with a natural ability that impressed even the local veterinarian. Lucas had discovered a gift for mechanics, spending hours in the ranch's workshop learning to repair equipment. Lily had appointed herself as Maria's gardening assistant, developing a green thumb that produced vegetables nobody had expected to grow in Montana soil. On Christmas Eve, almost exactly 1 year after that desperate night in the grocery store parking lot, Margaret stood on the ranch house porch watching her children play in the snow. But this time, they were building snowmen and having snowball fights, their laughter echoing across the valley. Daniel joined her on the porch, handing her a cup of hot chocolate. "Any regrets?" he asked. Margaret considered the question seriously. The past year had been transformative, but it had also been built on tragedy. She would always miss her husband, always wish their children could have known their father longer. "No regrets," she said finally. "I've learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best things. I lost my husband, but I gained a family. We lost our home, but we found our place." "And Morrison?" Margaret smiled. "Last I heard, he's selling his properties to pay legal fees and fines. Sometimes people create their own justice." Daniel nodded. "The kids want to know if we're going to officially adopt them." Margaret's heart skipped. "What did you tell them?" That we'd have to ask their mother first. Margaret turned to face him, seeing the hope and love in his eyes. Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. As the evening wore on, the extended family gathered around the fireplace. Maria read Christmas stories to the younger children, while Emma and Lucas helped Daniel plan the next day's activities. Margaret sat in the comfortable chaos, marveling at how dramatically their lives had changed. She thought about that night in the parking lot, feeding snow to her children because she had nothing else to give them. She remembered the desperation, the fear, the crushing weight of feeling like she was failing as a mother. Now, watching her children's faces glowing in the firelight, she understood that sometimes salvation comes from unexpected places. Sometimes the kindness of strangers becomes the foundation of something beautiful. Sometimes feeding your children snow in a parking lot is just the beginning of a story that ends with love, security, and hope. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside the ranch house, 3 children who had once been fed snow were now fed love, and that made all the difference in the world. Margaret had learned that home wasn't a place you paid rent on. It was a feeling you built with people who chose to love you. And in choosing to help a desperate family on a cold December night, Daniel and Maria had found the children they'd always prayed for, while Margaret had found the family she'd thought she'd lost forever. The story that began with desperation had transformed into something beautiful, proving that sometimes the darkest nights lead to the brightest dawns, and sometimes the kindness of strangers becomes the foundation of a family that will last forever.